something, but it's not where you want to have crops growing. So we have this real mismatch where people want to live is where the good farmland is.
Marilyn G. Wax, we'll have to end the conversation there. Thanks for being here.
Sure.
We'll be back tomorrow morning. The House is about to come in session for morning hour. Thanks for being with us.
The order of the House on January 5th, 2011. The Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and the minority leaders for a one-hour morning debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties. Each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall the debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to inform the House that one of our former colleagues, the Honorable Graham B. Purcell, Jr., has passed away at the age of 92. Graham Purcell was a larger-than-life figure who led a remarkable life of service. Whether it was as a soldier in World War II or a state judge or a U.S. congressman, he served with a strength of character and a love of country that has provided an example and an inspiration for many people, including me. A man of deep faith, Graham possessed a generosity of spirit that extended to all aspects of his life. He was a member of the greatest generation that saved the world from totalitarianism and then came home to build the most prosperous nation the world has ever known. But Graham Purcell was also an individual who would stand out in any generation, rising from humble roots to help make history. He was born in Archer County, Texas on May 5, 1919. After high school, he enrolled at Texas A&M, but the war came, and shortly after Pearl Harbor, he entered the Army, serving in Tunisia and Italy and earning, among other awards, the Silver Star. Even after he was discharged, he continued to serve in the Army Reserves for a number of years. When he returned from the war, he finished his degree at Texas A&M and then Baylor Law School. He practiced law for a few years, was appointed to be judge of the 89th District Court in Texas, and served from 1955 until 1962, when he resigned in order to run for Congress in a special election. Serving in the House from January 1962 to January 1973, Congressman Purcell focused primarily on his work on the Agriculture Committee, serving as chairman of the Livestock Subcommittee. He also played a key role in the Congressional Prayer Breakfast and served the people of North Texas with integrity and distinction for 11 years. After Congress, Graham practiced law and helped found a large law firm, and then served as a visiting district judge in Texas. But in whatever capacity, soldier, judge, congressman, citizen, Graham was committed to serving others. He and his wife Nancy just recently received an award for helping children in crisis in the Wichita Falls community. Graham Purcell led a rich, full, remarkable life. How many others can say that they shook hands with Winston Churchill when serving as a soldier in Italy? Had Vice President Johnson come pick him up at the airport just after he was elected in a special election to take he and his family to the Johnson home so they could stay there for a while until they had a chance to find a place of their own. Or on the last night of President Kennedy's life, spent more than an hour with him on the plane from Houston to Fort Worth, swapping stories back and forth, and then was in the motorcade the next day when President Kennedy was assassinated. Or made numerous trips back and forth to Vietnam to thank our soldiers for what they were doing there, always stopping at a burn unit along the way to make sure that those severely wounded would know that their country appreciated what they were doing. Or, at age 92, just a few weeks ago, offer important guidance and advice to one of his successors about the importance of putting the country first, ahead of party, ahead of personal considerations. Although Graham loved history, and he certainly loved to regale family and friends with some of his amazing stories, he was also a person who was always looking forward. He was consumed by what kind of country would be left to his children and grandchildren. And it was this focus on the common good that dominated his life story and really defined him as a man and as a public servant. He and his wife Nancy have 8 surviving children, as well as 25 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren, all of whom benefited from his loving care and will miss him greatly. Although Graham had many titles and roles in his life, he knew that first and foremost he was a child of God. And it was from this perspective that he lived, and it is in this assurance that he now rests. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This past Friday, the United States would have observed, celebrated would be entirely the wrong word, the 40th anniversary of the war on drugs. The war on drugs was initiated by President Richard Nixon, and he said we could have a war on drugs 40 years ago. And the fact is, 40 years later, we've spent nearly $1 trillion on the war on drugs. We have just as much drug use in this country as ever before. We've incarcerated millions and millions of people for victimless crimes. And when we get people who sell drugs, which we need to do, all that happens is, like a shark's teeth, they're replaced by the next in line, somebody else wanting to make money from a program that the public endorses and supports. So the war on drugs has been a terrible mistake. Now, don't get the wrong impression. I'm not suggesting that drug abuse and drug addiction is not a great problem that we must deal with. But our approach in treating it as a law enforcement matter and not as a health matter, a health care issue, has led to prison populations increasing, racial disparities of the greatest source in this nation in the arrest process, and a lost generation of people with no education and no job prospects because those arrests haunt them for the rest of their lives. Think about how many law enforcement resources have been wasted on drug arrests, nonviolent drug arrests, when policemen could be spending their time working against violent crime and crimes that are dangerous to people, robberies and murders and assaults and other offenses that are truly important to the American public. It has been estimated that the total criminal justice cost of marijuana arrests for state and local governments is as much as $7.6 billion a year. That averages out to about $10,000 per arrest. Think of all the serious criminals that could have been arrested instead. I was shocked recently to read that the New York City Police Department arrested 50,000 people for low-level marijuana offenses last year. New York City, 50,000 arrests for low-level marijuana offenses, more than during a 19-year period between 1978 and 1996 combined. Marijuana use has not skyrocketed in the last year, but arrests have vamped up. And they use arrest as a basis to get people, particularly people of color, where it's 7 times more likely you'll be arrested if you're African American and 4 times more likely you'll be arrested if you're Latino, and more likely if you're African American or Latino that you'll spend the night in jail than if you're Caucasian, as a way to take people and arrest them and deprive them of what should be their basic civil rights to go around the city. Our local budgets are straining like never before, and yet we see more arrests. It's time that we question this policy, this war, and knowing that insanity is repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. This is insane. For 40 years we've had this war on drugs. We've had a war on our own citizens. We've wasted monies that could be used for better things, and we've treated what is a health problem and a societal problem as a law enforcement problem. It is a mistake, and we need to change our approach. Drug courts have been a successful way to deal with this problem. We have drug courts in my community that have been successful in getting people to see a different approach to life. Not a jail, but a different approach. Racial disparities, as I mentioned, has been tremendous. 7 times more likely if you're African American, 4 times more likely if you're Latino to be arrested. These inequities run throughout our drug policy program and need to be corrected. We corrected a disparity between crack and cocaine, powder cocaine and crack, last year. It was 100 to 1 before we changed the law. It's now 18 to 1 in quantity. Still, it should be equal, and it results in racial disparities once again. I've introduced legislation, the Justice Integrity Act, which would study those disparities, and a Burn Program Accountability Act, which would require states to do studies on their racial disparities. The fact is, law enforcement makes arrests for these crimes sometimes to justify getting burn funds and getting funds from the federal government for the purpose of getting money into their programs and not providing justice. We need to have expungement laws so that people who have had nonviolent drug offenses can have their records expunged and go on and have a life get employment and a successful life in America. I've introduced the Fresh Start Act that says if you have a nonviolent offense, federal offense, and you spent 7 years and had a clean life, you can get your record expunged. This needs to become the law and give people a second chance. Otherwise, they can't get jobs and they resort to crime. Medical marijuana is an issue that's come up in this country, and most states that have had the opportunity to deal with it have passed it, mostly by percentages of over 60%. I had a good friend named Oral James Mitchell. Oral James Mitchell was a Navy SEAL and one of the strongest, toughest, best friends I ever had. When O.J. was 54, he got pancreatic cancer, and pancreatic cancer destroys a person, just whittles them away. And a guy who was 210 pounds who could do all those things the SEALs do, the hand-to-hand and the paratroops, and he used medical marijuana, and his mother said, thank God for the marijuana, it allowed Oral to have a sense of humor and to eat. It worked. I yield back the balance of my time and urge us to solve the war on crimes, the war on drugs, by getting out of it. It is a war. It is a crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Bastani, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, over 14 years in private practice in medicine, I had the great privilege to treat many, many Medicare patients, thousands of Medicare patients. I did open-heart surgery, complex open-heart surgery, lung cancer surgery, in times of great need, great difficulty for these seniors who had paid many years of their payroll taxes into the Medicare program with the hope and the recognition that this program would be there for them, for their health care needs in their later years. And I'll tell you, in the 90s, when I was in the midst of the peak of my practice, it was not unusual. In fact, quite often, patients would come into the emergency room with a very difficult situation without a primary care physician because they had not had previous health problems. And then what would happen is we would have to do emergency heart surgery on them. And once they got through all of this and got through the hospital stay, we could not find a primary care physician to take them on, to treat their everyday problems with hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, gout, and things of that nature. And I would get on a phone time and time again, and I would call family doctors and internal medicine physicians and plead with them, why can't you take this one more patient into your practice? And it's because the reimbursement situation for Medicare was so bad, even back then in the 90s, that if a physician took on too many Medicare patients, they couldn't meet their cost. And that situation's gotten much worse today in 2011. I can tell you that I have grave concerns about the future of the Medicare program and what's going to happen. And I'm not speaking as a member of Congress, I'm speaking as a physician, as somebody who cared for many, many patients, who valued that doctor-patient relationship. This situation whereby families who have a loved one on Medicare cannot find a primary care doctor, this is a very serious situation today and getting worse by the week. The bottom line is Medicare is in trouble. I saw this as a doctor and I see it now as a member of Congress. Just a couple of facts. Over 10,000 baby boomers are reaching retirement age every day, leaving fewer workers to support them. We have an aging population. And this is putting tremendous cost pressure on this Medicare program. In fact, the Medicare program, according to the Medicare actuaries, the trust fund that provides the money for the hospital program is going to be out of money by 2024. And in fact, starting last year, more money was being paid out than taken in to support this program. And in fact, the Medicare actuary predicts that without changes to the current law, something that was basically not looked at when the health care law was passed, in fact, it was assumed that these certain cuts to physicians would occur in the law. In fact, what we know is that without any changes to the law, physician reimbursements will fall from 80% of private rates to 57% of private rates in 2012. Now, what does that mean? That means that the situation for physician practices will get even worse, whereby they can't even meet the cost of their practice. And therefore, they're going to continue to limit their exposure to taking on new Medicare patients. That means access problems. That means Medicare patients cannot get access to physicians. We need real solutions to this. We need fact-based solutions. We need answers to the problem and not political rhetoric. And so far, that's all we've seen, largely coming from the other side and from the White House on this. In fact, we're on a path to see the bankruptcy of this Medicare program if we don't act. Now, let's take a step back and look at what happened in the health care bill. This health care bill, which passed without Republican support, cut over $500 billion from this Medicare program to expand coverage into a new entitlement, an extension of the Medicaid program. We're digging a deeper hole for ourselves without a way to pay for this. And now the plan calls for an immediate 17% cuts in benefits for our current seniors, not people who are going to go on to Medicare in the future, seniors who depend on this important program today. Another thing that's in this bill, and it's not well known, is a new bureaucratic entity that was created. There were many that were created in the health care bill, but there's one that really bothers me as a physician. It's called the Independent Payment Advisory Board. Okay, sounds kind of innocuous. Well, what does it do? It's a 15-person board arbitrarily chosen that will make life and death decisions about what things will be paid for under the Medicare program. Now, what is the recourse in all this? This is an arbitrary decision-making body, and you cannot dispute what this body is going to do. In fact, for Congress to override it, it would take 3/5 of the Senate to override it. This is going to damage the doctor-patient relationship. It's bad for Medicare patients. And I can tell you, Republicans have an idea about how we're going to fix this. I can't get into it now, and I'll do it in a subsequent speech. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Seek permission to address the House for 5 minutes to revise and extend.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members of the House, the default clock is ticking. We face a default on August 2nd if we do not raise the debt ceiling. Raising the debt ceiling is always a difficult vote. It is difficult because we have to do something that's necessary but not popular. Now, the question of the debt ceiling is about paying obligations already incurred. It's not about giving this House of Representatives permission to spend more money. But what has happened with this debt ceiling debate is that it is being used as leverage by both sides to try to get its way on a long-term budget resolution. And the reality is that this country needs both. It needs, number one, to have a long-term resolution on its fiscal situation, but number two, this is the immediate need, it has to pay its bills. America is a great country. It has always paid its bills, and the debt ceiling is about that and nothing more. And incidentally, those bills are ones that have been incurred by Congresses that many of us were never part of, and it's not a question of whether it's a bill that you would have supported incurring the expense for. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Medicare Prescription Part D, the 2 cuts in taxes during the Bush administration, all of which were on the credit card. I was against those, but those are obligations that we have, and we must pay them. The risk of default is enormous. Every increase in the interest rate of 1% will cost the American taxpayers $160 billion. The default clock is ticking. Now, 2 weeks ago, the majority brought to the floor a clean debt ceiling bill for the purpose of defeating it. And immediately upon bringing this bill to the floor and defeating it with unanimous Republican opposition and many Democrats voting no, members went back to their offices and called Wall Street and said, just kidding, we will raise the debt ceiling, but we wanted to send a signal. We are playing with fiscal fire here. You know, it's fine to negotiate, but negotiations cannot lead to default. Mr. Speaker, if we in this Congress, with the Republican majority now leading the way, fail to honor the nation's obligations by making good on our responsibility to pay our bills, Wall Street will again the bond markets will work its will, and we will lose our AAA credit rating, and we will do enormous damage to this economy. This is not about a Democrat or Republican speaking. Let me quote Chairman Bernanke and a few others who've commented on the urgency of paying our bills. Chairman Bernanke just yesterday said that failure to raise the debt ceiling would create fundamental doubts about the creditworthiness of the United States and damage the special role that the dollar and the Treasury securities have in global markets. Now, I understand the desire to use the debt limit deadline to force some necessary and difficult fiscal policy adjustments, Mr. Bernanke said, but the debt limit is the wrong tool for that important job. A few other people commenting on this. J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, a default would be a moral disaster. It will dwarf Lehman. Every single company with treasuries, every insurance fund, every requirement that it will start snowballing, automatic if you don't pay your debt. There will be default by rating agencies. All short-term financing will disappear. That's Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan. The Chamber of Commerce. Failure to raise the debt ceiling would create uncertainty and fear and threaten the credit rating of the United States. Moody's rating service on downgrading America's rating. Since the risk of continuing stalemate has grown, if progress in negotiations is not evident by the middle of July, such a rating action is likely. Fitch Rating Service. Failure to raise the debt ceiling in a timely manner would imply a crisis of governance that could imperil the U.S. AAA status. So we have two problems. We have a long-term problem that requires resolution, a long-term fiscal plan. But we have an immediate problem, and that is to protect the integrity of America's reputation for paying its bills. We have a downgrade in our rating. It's going to affect the interest rates that we pay, and that's going to hurt folks in Republican districts. It's going to hurt folks in Democratic districts who have no power to do anything. I yield back. We must raise our debt. We must pay our bills.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kainziger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last September, President Obama referred to America's small businesses as the anchors of our main streets. Unfortunately, economic data released on Wednesday proved that the president's actions speak louder than words. The failed policies of the Obama administration have left small businesses struggling. According to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, confidence in small business has dropped into recessionary levels. And the reason? Small businesses will tell you that their economic uncertainty is caused by low sales, high taxes, and burdensome government regulations. Now, I hail from the state of Illinois. Let me tell you a little story about Illinois. Illinois just went and raised its personal income tax level, and it raised its corporate tax level. So as a result of this, just a few days ago, we saw the Wall Street Journal put out an editorial which basically said, Illinois has raised $300 million in revenue because of the corporate tax increase. Oh, but however, because of the businesses threatening to leave Illinois, they've already spent $240 million in giveaways to corporations to keep them there. This idea, this thing that we've been on over the last couple of years of tax, borrow, and spend our way to prosperity isn't working. I remember when the president's economic, well, you know what, I mean, in my own home district, unemployment exceeds 11% in many of the counties. People are asking me, what are you doing to create jobs? Well, I'll tell them this. Look, the federal government can do one thing. We can create an environment for job creation, but the federal government doesn't create jobs, and that's been the problem. Because in the last 2 years, we've been counting an $800 billion stimulus as a miraculous jobs recovery bill. In fact, the president promised that by this time, unemployment would be 6.7%. How's that working out? The president's team promised that if we passed an $800 billion stimulus bill, unemployment would never exceed 8%. We saw it approach 10%. And now it's back on the rise again. Mr. Speaker, you don't solve our jobs problem by spending more money. Because we spent money. And where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? What we need to do is to understand that jobs are not created by this body, but they're created by the private sector. By the folks that get up every day and they put their minds together, they come up with an idea. They risk their capital, they risk their financial well-being, and they hire somebody in hopes that this dream that they have succeeds. In many cases, it doesn't. A lot of folks with an idea that begin a small business are not successful. But then they get up and they try again. But if you talk to any small business owner, you talk to any manufacturer in the United States, and they'll tell you what the biggest impediment to job creation is government regulation and taxation. Is there really anybody that believes? Now, I understand some people can argue we have to raise taxes to get more money to the government. Fundamental disagreement, but I understand people can argue that. But is there anybody that truly believes that raising taxes creates jobs? Is there anybody that really believes that? And what's the number one issue we have right now? We want to take people, almost 10%, the 9.1% of folks in this country that desperately want to have a job, we want to take them from a tax recipient to a taxpayer because they want to be a taxpayer too. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over and expecting different results each time. But you're going to get the same result. When this body spends money, when we spend $800 billion on a stimulus, we got nothing but a future of debt, doubt, and despair. Well, I believe we have a future in this country that's prosperous, that never accepts second best. There's a lot of youth watching here today that you have a job when you graduate from college. A future, a country that never accepts anything less than being a world leader. And I believe we never, ever accept second best. So when we talk about what to do in the future, we need to talk about the most important thing. We do have to rein in spending, but we have to get people back to work. And more spending isn't going to do that. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about Medicare. Medicare in a fact-based universe where truth matters. With Medicare, people's health is at stake and their financial life is at stake as well. Republicans and Democrats don't agree on much these days, but most people agree that the long-term deficits of this country are driven by ever-rising health care costs. If you solve the problem of skyrocketing health care costs, our deficit problem would largely go away. What to do is the problem. Democrats feel we have an unbreakable compact with seniors. Democrats think basic health needs of the elderly should be guaranteed and the elderly should never be driven into bankruptcy. Republicans think there is no compact with the elderly and that bankruptcy is just natural economics. So the Republicans have wanted to kill Medicare ever since it was passed in 1965. As recently as 1993, Speaker Gingrich said we wanted to wither on the vine. The craziest thing about the Republican plan to kill Medicare is that their plan does nothing to control costs. Despite all the Republicans screaming about budgets and deficits, their plan does nothing to fix the single largest problem that threatens the whole of our economic situation in this country. The Republican plan is to give seniors a coupon for about half their monthly premium and then walk away. If you can't pay the other half of the premium, too bad. No health care for you. If you can pay and it bankrupts you, too bad. Costs will continue to skyrocket. We Democrats think that the Ryan wrecking ball is the wrong way to go. Democrats are responsible stewards of the Medicare system. Democrats want to lower costs, improve care, and keep the elderly from going bankrupt. Now, it's important to keep the debate on Medicare reality-based. The fact is that we passed the health care law, when we passed it last year, The Republicans went around wildly screaming about death panels and scaring as many voters as possible. It was all politics, and it was not true. The fact is that the health care reform had 165 measures in it to improve Medicare. Medicare is about paying doctors, nurses, hospitals, drugs. The health care law improved Medicare by helping doctors focus more on taking care of patients, by keeping nurses from drowning in paperwork, and by making hospitals more efficient, and by getting fairer prices for drugs. The Democrats worked with hospitals to improve the payments and so saved the country $157 billion in the hospital payments. The Republican plan did nothing to save Americans money. It just shifted the cost from the government onto grandma and her kids. The Democratic health care law saved $136 billion by reducing payments to insurance companies. The Republican plan gave a runaway train of money to the insurance companies. The annual Medicare trustee report came out last month, and it said the new health care law was a sizable improvement to Medicare. $500 billion of savings and better care for more people. Those are the facts. It's what any good company would do: increase quality and lower costs. The Democrats have a plan for Medicare, and we passed it in the Accountable Care Act last year. That's why the Republicans want to repeal it. You got to understand what all this repeal talk is about. They want to get rid of the improvements that we made in health care. We cut money from one place that didn't make sense and improved care for prevention, for other places for seniors. We knew what we were doing, but the Republicans' goal has always been to end Medicare as we know it. They have been very clear from 1964 right straight through Newt Gingrich and through the Ryan plan. They don't want to have Medicare that guarantees seniors security. They want to give them a little coupon and say, now go find an insurance company that'll take care of you, Grandma. Think about that. Seniors want, what they really want is certainty. When you get old, what you worry about is, how am I going to take care of myself? And how am I going to help my kids and leave a little something to them? Am I going to have to go to my kids and say, I can't go to the doctor because I can't pay for it? They take that senior citizen Medicare card. It is their security. The Republicans want to get rid of it. We have already passed a plan to save it.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, words are inadequate to convey my profound respect, admiration, and gratitude for Trenton Diocese Bishop Emeritus John Mortimer Smith, who celebrated his Golden Jubilee, an amazing 50 years as a Catholic priest, on May 22nd in a Mass attended by over 800 people at the St. Mary of the Assumption Cathedral in Trenton, New Jersey. The Mass concelebrated by several bishops, including Bishop David O'Connell, now Bishop of Trenton, and several priests, including Bishop Smith's brother, Father Andrew Smith, was filled with joy and reflection, befitting acknowledgement of a great servant of God. In his moving homily, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick noted that Bishop Smith is, and I quote, an amazing, extraordinary brother, an extraordinary friend, a man filled with faith, filled with zeal, zeal for the church, zeal for the people he serves, and in a special way as bishop, zeal for his priests. The Cardinal said we are called to, quote, model Jesus Christ to our people and imitate Christ. Mort Smith, he continued, has lived it well. Cardinal McCarrick brought smiles and laughter throughout the cathedral when he said, I'm not here to canonize Bishop Smith, although that may come, and then went on to call Bishop Smith the world's greatest kibitzer due to his legendary penchant for telling stories, usually very long, usually and happily very funny. Once when I was about to give an address at the St. Thomas More dinner in Trenton, I turned to Bishop Smith, seated with my wife and me at a table, desperate for a joke. He gave me two, and I, courtesy of his jokes, had them rolling in the aisle. Bishop Smith's uncanny ability to infuse humor and hope-filled lightheartedness into almost all things is not only entertaining, but makes presentation of the gospel to an often confused and stressed-out world more efficacious. Bishop Smith connects amazingly well with the youth. I've witnessed it many times at schools and at the Catholic Men's Rally. Bishop Smith has an uncanny way of challenging everyone, especially our young people, to faithfully and courageously live the gospel. And you know, it never fails. Within a minute or two of being with Bishop Smith, you always find yourself smiling and your spirits lifted. For the many years that I've known him, Bishop Smith not only radiates the love of Christ, but he works hard and smart. Often I don't know where he finds the time. Ordained a priest on May 27, 1961, he has really done it all. Bishop Smith has earned several degrees and got his doctorate from Catholic University of America in the 60s and was deployed as a pastor in the Newark Archdiocese. Over the years, he has chaired or been the director of numerous boards, including the Institute for Continuing Theological Education, the U.S. Bishops' Consultation No. 4, and the Archdiocesan Vocation Board. He has also served in leadership positions on the Bishops' Committee on Migration and Refugee Services, and served on the board of directors of the St. Vincent de Paul Seminary, Notre Dame Seminary, St. Joseph College Seminary, St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, the Pontifical North American College in Rome, and Catholic Relief Services. And I'd note parenthetically he made 5 humanitarian trips to Africa as part of Catholic Relief Services' mission there. As bishop, his pastoral plan, led by the Spirit, identified 7 pastoral priorities, including dealing with charity and justice, pastoral leadership, ethnic diversity, young and young adult ministry, faith formation, and Sunday worship. Today, all 111 parishes in the Diocese of Trenton are developing action plans to implement led by the Spirit. Bishop Smith also created the Institute for Lay Ecclesial Ministry, which has formed and commissioned approximately 100 people to date. He also updated and expanded the strategic use to advance the gospel and the culture of life, and created Real Faith TV, an award-winning teen talk show. And he boosted the Trenton Diocese online outreach to the Hispanic community to protect the sanctity of human life and to reach an ever wider audience with news and commentary published in the excellent diocesan newspaper, The Monitor. Faced with declining enrollment in the diocesan schools, largely due to escalating costs, which includes some 36 elementary schools and 8 high schools, Bishop Smith's Commitment to Excellence initiative established benchmarks to make an already effective education program even better. Mr. Speaker, my wife Marie and I were among those offering prayers of thanks at Bishop Smith's Jubilee Mass. We rejoiced with his family and friends for his accomplishments that are without number. We rejoiced over his bold, consistent, and compassionate commitment to defending unborn children, their mothers, and the sanctity of life. We rejoiced and were inspired anew by his life well lived. And, Mr. Speaker, we gave thanks that while his extraordinary ministry has changed, he is far from done.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a year and a half ago we were promised a new way forward in Afghanistan, a way that would include a significant military drawdown. The date for the redeployment to begin was July 1, 2011, just 2 weeks away. Then last year, the goalposts were moved, and it was decided that, in fact, our troops would remain in Afghanistan through 2014. But apparently that wasn't enough. Negotiations are now underway with the Karzai government, negotiations that are happening apparently in secret and without proper accountability and transparency for the construction of military bases in Afghanistan. Officials are being careful, very careful, not to say that these bases would be permanent, but it's clear that our government could be hammering out the details of an agreement that would call for U.S. military presence in Afghanistan for as far as the eye can see. I can't understand the logic here, Mr. Speaker. Why can't we grasp the very idea that the longer we are perceived to be an occupying power, the more resentment we breed in Afghanistan? The longer we're there, the more we fuel the insurgency, the more we leave our troops vulnerable, the more we put our own national security in jeopardy. Erecting permanent bases would be the biggest favor we could do for the Taliban. I salute my good friend and fellow Californian, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, for her leadership on this issue. And I would urge my colleagues to consider my legislation that would require the President to negotiate a status of forces agreement that would clearly prohibit the establishment of permanent bases. Mr. Speaker, the outgoing Defense Secretary, Mr. Gates, says we're seeking joint bases where the United States acts as a tenant as opposed to an occupying force. But I don't believe for a minute that the Taliban appreciates the subtlety of that distinction. As long as there are boots on the ground, and not just boots, but large installations with American trappings and English language street signs and so forth, the more we embolden the very radical forces we're trying to defeat. We're going in exactly the wrong direction, Mr. Speaker. At a moment when the American people are crying out for this military occupation to end, our leaders look as if they are preparing to extend it into perpetuity. At a moment when casualties are a long-term present, at a moment when casualties are on the rise, we're preparing for a long-term presence that will further endanger, not protect, Americans. We can't afford permanent war. It's unsustainable. We can't afford the cost in blood, treasure, lost credibility, or dwindling moral authority. It's time to bring our troops and our contractors home and leave no military footprint behind. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Burkle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to call attention to the issue of elder abuse. Today is Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Hundreds of thousands of Americans each year are the victims of elder abuse. According to the National Center on Elder Abuse, this number could be as high as 1 to 2 million Americans. Elder abuse, Mr. Speaker, is a broad term for the victimization of seniors 65 years and older. There is no one picture of what elder abuse looks like. It can be physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or exploitation. The perpetration of elder abuse also varies. Spouses, partners, caregivers in nursing homes, even neighbors. Our older elder Americans are especially vulnerable to abuse, particularly those who suffer from dementia or other mental diseases. I find it unconscionable that the very people who fought for us in World War II and Korea, who nurtured us, who taught us, who built this society around us, would be victimized in the twilight of their lives. Our elderly citizens have given us so much, and they deserve our appreciation, our respect, and most importantly, our protection. Not just for what they've contributed, Mr. Speaker, but for the ways they still enrich our society and enrich us as a people. This August, my mother, Mr. Speaker, will turn 90 years old. 3 years ago, when my father died, she was lost. She was particularly vulnerable. Fortunately for my mother, she has children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to help her and to support her. But how many other Americans, elderly folks, are out there who don't have that support system, Mr. Speaker? This is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. This is an American issue. Our seniors, our elderly, deserve our help. They deserve our protection. Please, as Americans, Today is Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Let us be particularly aware of our most vulnerable, our elderly citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support of farmers and producers all across these United States, and especially in the 7th Congressional District of Alabama. As we debate and discuss issues surrounding the Agriculture Appropriation Bill, let us remain mindful of the enormous impact that the agriculture sector has had on the United States and our world economy. Agriculture employs more than 21 million American workers and accounts for 15% of the total U.S. workforce. In fact, in my home state of Alabama, agriculture contributes nearly $5 billion to the state's economic sector every year. Any agriculture appropriations bill must take into account the potential economic impact and the strengthening of agriculture sector that is needed for the 21st century. I understand that we are making very difficult budgetary decisions. However, I am concerned that the types of cuts proposed in this year's agriculture appropriation bill are ill-advised and disproportionate. This bill reduces the funding for agricultural research programs, including the Agricultural Research Service and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, by over $354 million from last year's level. Now, I know that that's a substantial cut in very important research that must be done both nationally and within our individual states. In fact, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, fulfills this mission by supporting research, education, and extension programs at land-grant universities, like those in Alabama, Auburn, Tuskegee, Alabama A&M universities, and others. We must preserve funding for each of these critical and important investments in the future of agriculture research and food safety. Now, under the Republican appropriation bill, food and nutrition programs like SNAP and Children Nutrition are funded at nearly $2 billion less than the President's budget. SNAP is an important and essential program in these challenging times for low-income individuals who cannot afford to purchase food for themselves and their families. Since the program was created, SNAP has literally saved millions of lives and currently provides essential support to over 165,000 individuals in my district alone. The proposed funding for Women, Infants, and Children Food Assistance Program, WIC as it's known, is far below what is needed to serve all those individuals who are eligible for the benefit. WIC provides essential nutrition to new mothers, babies, and small children under 5 that are nutritionally at risk. Nearly 50% of the babies born in our country each year rely on WIC. In Alabama, WIC provides assistance to over 140,000 individuals and over 25,000 just in my district alone. Contrary to popular belief, this program is cost efficient, and it serves nearly 10 million people each year, costing less than $100 per person receiving benefit. The lack of proper funding in this appropriation bill is yet another example of Republican attack on hardworking families and children that definitely need assistance for nutrition. I cannot stand idly by and let this occur. We must ensure that any appropriations bill provides robust and adequate funding for these essential programs both now and in the future. The Republican Agriculture Appropriation Bill reduces funding for essential rural development programs by $337 million below last year's levels. Now, these reductions disproportionately impact loan authority for 502 direct housing programs. Without these loans, low-income rural families could not find financing options that would help them purchase homes and simply be able to live. This bill also seeks to reduce funding for agriculture business and rural business grants by $20 million below last year's levels. In a time of economic recovery, we must continue to make strategic investments in small and rural businesses and not make reductions. It is important that we, who know better, do better. Agriculture in our global society is of the utmost importance. As our global population increases, food security and adequate food production will be necessary for our national security, economic development, and our overall survival. It is my hope that all on both sides of the aisle will pass an agricultural appropriations bill that is both fiscally responsible, forward-thinking, and makes economic sense. I yield back the rest of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back her time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Dunham, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about natural resources and whether or not they can create American jobs. The answer is yes. With oil production alone, 1.2 million jobs between the 3 bills that Republicans passed out of committee and off of the House floor. A total of 2 million jobs if you add in the American Energy Independence and Price Reduction Act. 2 million American jobs. Not only can we be energy independent in our great nation, but we can put Americans back to work with 2 million jobs alone in this area. We need to have states' rights, allowing states to explore oil exploration or natural gas or utilize all of their natural resources, whether you're in Alaska and you want to drill in Anwar, or you're the governor of California and you want to pass Tranquillion Ridge and clean off the old oil wells off of the coast. States should have those rights to be able to do that and to be able to put their own people back to work in those states. The President's policies on our natural resources are just flawed. My friends across the aisle continue to talk about the bills that come off of this floor and whether they create jobs or not. This is indisputable, 2 million jobs. You don't have to like these jobs, but nevertheless, they're American jobs, and it gives us our energy independence. Now, the President has talked about we have 2% of the world's oil, but we utilize 25% of the world's oil with our vehicles. Now, I agree we use 25%. We've got a lot of cars on the roads. We have a lot of goods movement. But 2%, the number is flawed again. As we have went through the Natural Resources Committee, we have over 65% of the world's natural resources between natural gas, oil, and oil shale. We just have to be willing to go get it. So rather than going to Brazil, rather than going to the Middle East and putting our troops at risk, we ought to be self-sufficient and utilize our own natural resources and put Americans back to work in the process. Now, in my district, we've got natural resource issues as well. You know, we've seen timber issues across the nation. In Arizona, we've seen catastrophic disasters with natural forests. In my district, we've got natural forests as well. These national forests, we've got to manage better. We've got to be able to take the fuel off of the forest floor. We've got to be able to harvest some of the timber. We'll never catch up at this point because our timber harvesting plans are so far behind. But nevertheless, we've got to put Americans back to work. We've got to put Californians back to work dealing with our timber industry. And in the Central Valley, where we have the largest abundance of ag production, all of the fresh fruits, the nuts, packaged salads, we have so many different things that California produces, and yet we see some of the highest unemployment in the nation. As our national unemployment continues to escalate, we're at 9.1% now. We're double that in the Central Valley. And it's a direct correlation to the water. One of our natural resources, when you shut off the water to the valley and only give it 10% of the contracted allocation, you have 36% unemployment. And in some cities, it's even higher. When you go to the food lines and you see Americans, 44% unemployment in some cities, it seems un-American to not utilize our natural resources. So we have the ability in this great nation. We have the bills that we're passing off of this floor. What we need to do is have the will to move them through both houses and encourage the President to have American jobs. Not Republican jobs. These aren't Republican jobs. Not Democrat jobs, but American jobs. putting people back to work, avoiding the natural disasters that happen with forest fires and the natural disasters we have with flooding when we don't manage our water, creating clean energy in the process. But the most important issue, when you've got 9.1% unemployment and escalating across the nation, when you've got double that in the Central Valley and continuing to escalate, but you have the natural resources and the ability to solve your own problems but ignore the fact and don't do so, we have an American problem with jobs. As Republicans, we're willing to fix that problem. We will continue to pass these natural resource bills. But at some point, we would ask our friends across the aisle to work with us. We will not solve California's energy problems or the nation's job issue without addressing our natural resources. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Well, I appreciate the fact that the gentleman who preceded me in the well talked about unemployment and creating jobs, and I may not have agreed with his particular nostrums, but at least that's one Republican who's talking about creating jobs. Unfortunately, the Republican majority in the last 6 months of leadership in the House has brought forward no bills to put Americans back to work, except they say do more of the same. What? Yes, more of the same. The last decade, George Bush dramatically cut taxes twice, decreased regulations, under the theory that that would create jobs. Unfortunately, the facts are in. We had the worst job creation post-World War II in the last decade under George Bush and doubled the deficit and debt while doing it. Didn't create jobs. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. Didn't work in the Reagan era, didn't work then. Compare that to the Clinton era. We raised taxes, yeah, particularly on rich people and big corporations. We actually balanced the budget. We paid down debt. We had 3.8% unemployment, and real incomes went up for the middle class. I'd love to go back to those bad old days, but no, it's the Bush policies that'll work. We just got to do more of them. Reduce spending even more. Government can't do anything to create jobs. They say, well, what about investing in the nation's infrastructure? Who built the national highway system? Who built the bridges? Who built the transit systems in this country? Who helped build the rail systems? Who has maintained our ports and waterways? The federal government, sometimes in partnership with states or local government or the private sector. But those investments pay off. And what do the Republicans want to do? In face of 150,000 bridges on the national highway system that are about to, or not in the not-too-distant future, have the same fate as the bridge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that is, collapse, they need either total replacement or repair 150,000 bridges, 40% of the pavement on the national highway system. $60 billion backlog on our transit systems. They want to cut federal investment in transit, and they say if we give that money to rich people and to the corporations who are sitting on $2 trillion worth of cash, they'll take care of the problem. Oh, really? What are you going to do? Toll 150,000 bridges across the country in order to induce the private sector to come in and rebuild them? You're going to toll the existing interstate in order to bring it up to a decent system of good repair? And transit systems, they all lose money. Now, some on the Republican side say, well, we should do away with transit systems. You know, everybody just like, we don't need those things. Come on. Let's have a little bit of common sense here. You want to talk about saving fuel? Invest in transit. You want to talk about creating jobs? Invest in infrastructure. We have the strongest Buy American requirements in transportation and infrastructure as any program of the federal government. We create more jobs per $1 billion than anything else, way more than the Defense Department, where they want to shower all their funds, can be created in transportation. We can put Americans to work. Not only construction workers who have horrible unemployment, not only steel workers for the bridges, not only people who maintain these systems, but engineers, software engineers, people who make tires, people who make rail cars, people